Of all the weapons in the whole history of warfare, none in its time was so hated, feared, and despised by its enemies as the English longbow.
The English longbow was the decisive weapon of the Middle Ages. Nothing could rival it for range, accuracy, and devastating power.
The immense power of this thing was really surprising. There were cases where longbows would literally shoot through trees. They were capable of penetrating armor, even the thickest plate armor, at short ranges, and mail almost all the time.
There was nothing quaint about the English longbow. In the hands of a trained archer, it was a killing machine.
The English archer, with a good bow in his hand, could kill a French man-at-arms at 100 yards or more every time. That's how good this thing is.
It was on a muddy field in northern France in 1415 that the longbow won its greatest victory. Here at Agincourt, 5,000 English archers defeated a French army 5 times its size, and an English myth was born.
But we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
But behind the rhetoric lies the reality, a ruthless and bloody battle won by a lethal weapon, the longbow. The longbow was made from the simplest of materials. Its unique characteristics come from nothing more complex than the wood of a yew tree.
The English longbow at its best was made from continental yew. It was made from one piece, a self-stave of yew, which was kept to the best quality possible, and it comprised of the heartwood of the yew and the sapwood of the yew. Now, the sapwood of the yew is an excellent resistor of tension, while the heartwood is an excellent resistor of compression. So in one piece of wood, you've got a natural spring.
Well, this is a bow stave before the process of bow making has started. It's a 7-foot stave of yew wood. There's the pale, creamy sapwood on the back, the part away from the archer, the outside of the bend, and there's the brown heartwood inside.
The transformation of wood into finished weapon is a precise art, developed over centuries. The stave is shaped and honed to give it power and suppleness. When the bow is finished, it is tested for strength and balance on a device called a tiller. The wood has come alive.
The whole thing describes the perfect arc of a circle.
So this thing had both flexibility and great power. And that's really why it was so lethal, not because it was long, but because of what it was made of.
Although the bowmaker's art survived through the ages, no one really knew for sure just how powerful the medieval longbow really was, until 1982. Divers exploring the wreck of the Tudor warship, the Mary Rose, made an extraordinary discovery. 138 longbows perfectly preserved. For the first time, historians could get their hands on the real thing. They were astonished to discover that the power, or draw weight, of a genuine longbow was nearly twice what anyone had thought.
You have to have bows within the strength range of these. The strength, the draw weight is measured by what you're holding apart at the length of the arrow. That is what the weight of a bow is. These bows range from perhaps a little bit less than 100 pounds at the very weakest, of which there aren't many, right up to the very top at 170, 180 pounds here, which a lot of people say can't be drawn, but they can.
These enormous draw weights had one purpose: to penetrate the armour of the medieval knight. The longbow may have been simple in concept, but it demanded strength and years of rigorous training to use effectively.
You'd have to start from a very young age to learn to shoot the larger bows, and progress and progress. Also, you'd have to practice on a daily basis to be really good with the longbow.
The prowess of the English archer was feared throughout Europe. This was no accident. For over a century before Agincourt, English kings had made practicing the longbow compulsory for men of fighting age.
There were rigorous rules to make eligible young men practice the bow for war. Near most large churches in any decent-sized village, there were butts where they were compelled to shoot at least once a week and probably every night. This Sunday practice was so rigorously applied that it made illegal other sports such as cambuck, whatever that may be, volleyball, football, the great national game, the great national disease was forbidden. All these other games were stopped so that, and you were fined for being found at them, so that you would practice the bow.
The result was a corps of highly trained civilian fighters, drawn largely from the middle or yeoman class. Neither aristocratic knight nor lowly peasant, they were a new presence on the medieval battlefield.
The majority of archers, I think, would have been quite young men. The pages who served at battles as sort of servants perhaps were around 12 to 14. Some of the archers then, I think, would have been no older than about 16, 17, perhaps ranging up to their mid-20s. Most of them, I think, would have been unmarried. Some of them would have been farmers. We know husbandmen, labourers, perhaps the yeomen in the classic rich peasant sense. Others would have been townsmen, some with crafts. We know that some of them were butchers, tailors, carpenters, bakers, that kind of thing.
Because these yeomen represented a very distinctive social class of kind of the precursors of what might even be called a middle class, they were not people necessarily to be taken lightly.
And they knew it. Cocksure and insolent, they have left us with an enduring legacy.
The English have a strange gesture that dates back to the days of Agincourt, where they stick 2 fingers up in the air as a gesture of defiance. If the French caught an English archer, they'd cut the 2 fingers off on both the right and left hand, thus stopping him from drawing the longbow again.
It was to these men, along with a smaller number of aristocratic knights or men-at-arms, that Henry V turned as he prepared to fight the French. Having inherited his throne from a usurper king, Henry needed a good war abroad to tighten his grip on power back home.
When Henry became king in 1413, of course he was still quite young. He was only 26, and he wanted to prove himself in war, but I think also he wanted to improve the lot of his dynasty. He wanted to prove himself against the ancient enemy, the French.
Henry and his army set sail from Southampton on August the 11th, 1415. His force was made up of 8,000 archers and 2,000 knights. Like the D-Day invaders more than 500 years later, they headed for the Normandy coast. The plan was to take Harfleur and then head for Paris, but things went wrong right from the start. Harfleur held out far longer than expected, and the English started dying of disease.
At the siege of Harfleur, many men, of course, took ill. They suffered from dysentery. There were problems with the water supply. It's said, too, in the sources that they ate fruit from the trees, which caused them to have pretty awful diarrhea. It seems, too, that bodies were left to rot, and that also was seen as a cause of disease.
Harfleur finally fell in September, too late for Henry to advance on Paris. But he refused to retreat. Against the wisdom of his advisers, he decided to taunt the French by marching to Calais, some 250 miles away to the north. This was a show of bravado. But when he reached the River Somme, his plan ran into trouble. A French army was lying in wait on the northern bank. If the English were to reach Calais, they would have to try to outflank the enemy. The English army felt its way along the southern bank of the river, looking for a safe crossing. The French shadowed them on the other side, matching their every move. The English were soon out of rations. The situation was desperate. After 7 days of being stalked, the English managed to steal a day's march on the French and finally crossed the Somme. The French were in pursuit. Scenting an easy kill, their army was growing day by day. On October the 21st, 9 days after the chase had begun, the French overhauled the English, cutting across their path. By now, the French were 5 times the size of the English. Their tracks in the mud told a grim tale, as an English eyewitness recorded. We found the roads quite remarkably churned up by the French army, as it had crossed ahead of us, thousands strong. And the rest of us, fearing battle to be imminent, raised our hearts and eyes to heaven, crying out, with voices expressing our inmost thoughts, that God would have pity on us and turn us away from the violence of the French. Three days later, the French blocked the road to Calais. Battle was now inevitable. That evening, the two armies bedded down with only a field separating them. This field was soon to be known as Agincourt, and the battle that was fought there was to be the greatest test for the English longbow.
As dawn broke on the 25th of October, the English must have felt themselves to have been in a desperate position, and they were hugely outnumbered, perhaps as much as 5 to 1. Their path to safety at Calais had been barred by a major French army, and they were in a position of near starvation. We know that the English prayed before the battle, and each archer took in his mouth a piece of earth to symbolize dust to dust, and I imagine that many of them thought that they would not live to see the next day.
As dawn broke, the English took up their position on the battlefield. The 1,000 men-at-arms were drawn up in 3 groups, with Henry at the centre. The 5,000 archers were placed in 2 groups at the flanks. Some may have been positioned alongside the men-at-arms. To strengthen their position, they used a simple but effective means of defence.
The king had ordered the archers to cut stakes about 6 feet long, and these were hammered into the ground in front of them, and the archers would fire from behind these, so they acted as a form of defence, and particularly they made it very difficult for the French horses to penetrate close enough to the archers.
The French were divided into 3 colossal groups. The 1st battalion alone is thought to have consisted of 18,000 knights on foot. On the wings were the French cavalry. So confident were they of victory that the French pushed their own archers so far back to the rear that they played no part in the coming battle.
Well, I'm here approximately where the French army took position the day of the Battle of Agincourt. The French captains understood perfectly the danger of longbow and of English archers. So they had a plan to fight against the English army, and this plan was to attack the wings and the flanks of this English army.
It's a great mistake, I think, to see the French as militarily inept. They certainly weren't. They knew from experience the power of the English longbow. and their tactical thinking, their preparation to try and defeat Henry's army, is shown in the Somme plan. Now, this was a plan for battle drawn up prior to the Battle of Agincourt.
The Somme plan, which has only recently been rediscovered, proves that the French did have a strategy to defeat the English longbow. A twin-pronged cavalry charge, sweeping wide on both flanks, would encircle the archers and crush them. But for the plan to work, the French knights needed plenty of room for manoeuvre.
But on this battlefield, there was a great problem. This battlefield is very narrow. It is 600, maybe 700 meters wide. It's too narrow to have great tactical possibilities.
The Somme plan had another problem. It depended on a manageable number of knights, but the French army was now so swollen that there were too many men on the field. Far from guaranteeing victory, the numerical superiority of the French worked against them.
If this plan had been followed by the vanguard that was the French advance force, only numbering about 6,000 men, but far more flexible than the huge numbers that in fact take part in the Battle of Agincourt, the French might well have won.
That tall clump of trees marks the very center of the battlefield. How do we know that? Because that's where upwards of 6,000 French were buried after the battle in 3 trenches. From this position, seeing that the French were doing nothing but furling their banners and sitting down to breakfast, roughly where you see that thin line of trees further behind the big clump. So Henry V had his army move slowly forward in 3 separate moves so as to keep alignment, to keep discipline, until they were perhaps 200 yards short of that clump of trees, where at extreme range the English archers opened up and thus started the Battle of Agincourt.
The archers were proving to be highly effective. Rather than sweeping wide to encircle the English, the cavalry were funneled towards the centre of the battlefield.
As these armored knights approached the killing zone at high velocity, they found themselves in a lethal environment. Not only could their armor be penetrated by these long shafts, but their horses were being shot down with great rapidity, causing them to basically fly off their horses. Now, the point of this is that the armored knight needed to be at point-blank range to affect his casualties, but he was still literally hundreds of yards away from these yeomen. So he was essentially helpless in this environment.
The cavalry charge of the French on either side came in very depleted form, and by the time it got anywhere near our lines, it had in fact been shot to pieces. Hundreds, thousands of arrows hurling at them. So thick that it darkened the sky, so heavy that it seemed like hail, said contemporary eyewitnesses. And the horses were turned back in complete disarray, wounded, out of control, into the front line of the then advancing French central infantry. Some 18,000 seems to me the likely number of the first French battalion that now marched on the English.
This was the second phase of the battle. The French knights now advanced on foot through the muddy battlefield towards the English. The archers, having seen off the cavalry charge, now had a new set of targets.
We're standing in the centre of the battlefield here, on the verge of the killing ground, the French advancing across the ploughed field behind me into an arrow storm delivered by the English bowmen.
These great clouds of arrows forced the French knights on foot to bunch inwards, an almost automatic response to an oncoming cloud of arrows is to shy away. And this constricted what was already a very densely packed body of men on foot.
And remember, all the time they've got riderless horses running in amongst them, knocking them down, so they were stumbling, they were blinded, and really panicking, I think, is very likely. Once the French men-at-arms are in contact with the English men-at-arms, the archers' role changes. They throw down their bows, they pick up their short, heavy swords known as falchions, great chopping blades, and their mauls, that is to say their lead-tipped mallets they use for driving in the stakes, and go and mix it with the French men-at-arms, many of whom, of course, are bewildered or exhausted, and are literally physically knocked down and taken for ransom by the lightly equipped English.
For an aristocratic French knight, a close encounter with this new breed of warriors was a horrifying and humiliating experience.
They did not approve of being shot at by people they regarded as peasants. That wasn't their idea of warfare at all. It was gentleman against gentleman, honor against honor. And in that chivalric code, you were able to yield to a noble opponent. But the idea of yielding to people from the soil, to yeomen from the counties of England and Wales, was really more than they could encompass.
When the last French knights were forced to yield, the Battle of Agincourt was effectively over. But for the English archers, there was more killing to be done. Afraid that the French were about to mount another charge, Henry ordered that his French prisoners be killed on the spot. The English men-at-arms hesitated, reluctant to break this ultimate code of chivalry. But the archers had no such inhibitions.
Henry can't find many men-at-arms who are prepared to do it, and he has to appoint a squire and archers to start the slaughter.
At Agincourt, the English archers gave the French an unforgettable lesson in a new kind of war. The English longbow was the decisive weapon of the Middle Ages. Nothing could rival it for range, accuracy, and devastating power.
The immense power of this thing was really surprising. There were cases where longbows would literally shoot through trees. They were capable of penetrating armor, even the thickest plate armor, at short ranges, and mail almost all the time.
There was nothing quaint about the English longbow. In the hands of a trained archer, it was a killing machine.
The English archer, with a good bow in his hand, could kill a French man-at-arms at 100 yards or more every time. That's how good this thing is.
It was on a muddy field in northern France in 1450. Finished, it is tested for strength and balance on a device called a tiller. The wood has come alive.
The whole thing describes the perfect arc of a circle.
So this thing had both flexibility and great power. And that's really why it was so lethal, not because it was long, but because of what it was made of.
Although the bowmaker's art survived through the ages, no one really knew for sure just how powerful the medieval longbow really was, until 1982. Divers exploring the wreck of the Tudor warship, the Mary Rose, made an extraordinary discovery. 138 longbows perfectly preserved. For the first time, historians could get their hands on the real thing. They were astonished to discover that the power, or draw weight, of a genuine longbow was nearly twice what anyone had thought. 15, that the longbow won its greatest victory. Here at Agincourt, 5,000 English archers defeated a French army 5 times its size, and an English myth was born.
But we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
But behind the rhetoric lies the reality. A ruthless and bloody battle won by a lethal weapon. The longbow. The longbow was made from the simplest of materials. Its unique characteristics come from nothing more complex than the wood of a yew tree.
The English longbow, at its best, was made from continental yew. It was made from one piece, a self-stave of yew, which was kept to the best quality possible, and it comprised of the heartwood of the yew and the sapwood of the yew. Now, the sapwood of the yew is an excellent resistor of tension, while the heartwood is an excellent resistor of compression. So in one piece of wood, you've got a natural spring.
Well, this is a bow stave before the process of bow making has started. It's a 7-foot stave of yew wood. There's the pale, creamy sapwood. On the back, the part away from the archer, the outside of the bend, and there's the brown heartwood inside.
The transformation of wood into finished weapon is a precise art, developed over centuries. The stave is shaped and honed to give it power and suppleness. When the bow is
Of all the weapons in the whole history of warfare, none in its time was so hated, feared, and despised by its enemies as the English longbow.